So it's been sort of almost universally lauded that this is a good thing that these companies are raising wages. What are some of the knock-on effects?
Thanks for having me. It is really interesting that a number of retailers are voluntarily raising their minimum wage. Most recently, Walmart raised its wage from $10 to $11. I just want to point out that in part this is happening because the labor market's tight. Unemployment rate is 4.1%. But the $10 to $11 increase is a 10% increase in the starting wage at a time when overall wages are rising more like 3%. So what this is doing is it's compressing the wage distribution, meaning wages are rising more at the bottom in these companies than overall. And so the natural question is, what happens within the companies? Well, we looked at some interesting cases. We looked at an interesting case where a major retailer did increase wages, and a little bit of a quirky scenario where some workers got a 2% raise and other very similar workers got a 4% raise. And so what we did is we tracked to see what happens to their quit rates, how long they stick around, depending if essentially they got lucky or unlucky, and if their coworkers got lucky or unlucky. And here's what we found. Getting a higher wage, getting a raise, definitely reduces quits, so that's good news for retailers raising wages. And in general, that seems to have a bigger effect for wages for workers earning low wages. And that also is good news for retailers looking to raise wages at the very bottom. That seems to have a bigger effect, a bigger bang for the buck than raising wages overall across the board.
So your research looks at the idea of whether people feel that they're being paid fairly within their company. And some people might feel that, like, let's say you were making $11.50 already and someone starts off at 11. Some people might say, oh, that's unfair. I've been here a while. But what you find is that that is not as pernicious of an issue as people feeling like the people who make more than them got a raise that to them didn't seem fair.
Yeah, to be sure, both of those matter, right? We know, for example, when the minimum wage rises because of government action, firms also raise wages for those who are earning a little bit above the minimum to begin with. And that's the kind of spillover effects that happen because you don't want to change the wage structure too much. For example, if a shift supervisor was making $2 above the frontline worker and suddenly the minimum wage rises by $2, you don't want the shift supervisor to make the same as the frontline worker. So maybe their wage rises by $1 or even $1.50. So keeping that wage structure in line is one component. But the other component is people particularly get upset when they think they're getting paid less than their coworkers who are doing similar jobs. And for that reason, raising the wage from the very bottom can be a pretty effective way for reducing quits and reducing turnover, especially in low-wage sector like retail.
We talk a lot in the media, and I know in academia you talk about this as well, the gap in wages between the lowest paid workers and the highest paid workers, the CEO, the executive suite, for example. So did you find in your research that there was more resentment to perhaps of the people that the lowest paid workers work with directly as opposed to the folks who are in the C-suite? And how much then does raising the minimum wage address that resentment and address the income inequality perception and dissatisfaction?
In the particular work where we were following quit behavior of retail workers, it was mostly looking at similarly paid workers. At the same time, other research does suggest that sometimes employers have paid a lot of attention to keeping inequality low within the company. For example, the dramatic growth in wage and earnings inequality in the United States has mostly happened between firms, much more than within firms. What does that mean and why is that happening? One reason is because some of the lowest wage functions have actually been outsourced. Think janitorial services. A lot of janitorial services used to be done in-house 30, 40 years ago. A lot of it is done by contractors today. One reason why is because it allows firms to potentially pay a lower wage to lower paid service workers without affecting morale as much. So I think the overall set of evidence suggests there's quite a bit of attention that workers pay to who they see as their comparison or peers. And firms pay attention to, I think, also changing the demarcation of who exactly counts as coworkers, especially at a time when inequality has been on the rise.
This idea that inequality is a function of between firms as opposed to merely the lowest paid versus the CEO in any given company, one of these topics I see a lot of econ wonk types talk about, but I don't think it's broken through so much. How much of this is a function of that more and more industries seem to be winner take all, and you have a Google and a Facebook or an Amazon taking over so much of retail? And so if you were lucky and you were working for Amazon early on, you've done fantastically well. And if you were working for some other bookstore or something like that, not so much. And between those two different people, an extraordinary difference in wages and outcomes.
Yeah, absolutely. New research strongly points to the importance of product market concentration. We're talking about the winner-take-all type scenario in affecting wage inequality. So you have an increasing amount of profits are concentrated at the top today, and as a result, workers in those firms end up getting paid more, but there's just less of them. And as a result, that kind of feeds into inequality. Another thing I should point out is there's also a lot of concentration in the labor market. So both of those things, concentration in the product market, market power in price setting, and market power in wage setting, both seem to matter in how that affects wage inequality.